Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Peace Island Institute's Honoring Black Leadership Lecture. I hope all of you are doing well and that you are staying safe and healthy. My name is Asan, and I will be the program moderator for today. To give a brief introduction about myself, I am from Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm currently a senior at Boston College studying political science and English. We gather today to discuss issues that are of utmost importance in the world today. Nearly 60 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took great strides in his activism work for the civil rights movement. He stopped at no ends in the fight for justice and equality, playing a key role in the movement as an influential leader. This upcoming Monday is the Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service, a national holiday meant to encourage all Americans to work to improve their own communities. We hope that by engaging in dialogue today, we will be honoring the late Dr. King. On behalf of the Peace Islands Institute, we would like to express our gratitude to Reverend Frederick Streets, who has joined us tonight in honoring Black leadership. We thank you for giving us your time to come talk to us. We would also like to thank the many organizations who made this event possible. Thank you to the Peace Islands Institute of Boston, the Peace Islands Institute of Connecticut, the Boston Dialogue Foundation, the Peace Valley Foundation, and the Maple Foundation. After the lecture, there will be a Q&A session with Reverend Streets, so please feel free to send any and all questions in the chat box. Before we get started, I'd like to give a brief introduction on the Peace Islands Institute of Boston, a nonprofit organization devoted to promoting interfaith and intercultural dialogue. We welcome everyone in a society with practical programs to connect people in the real world. Our goal is to build loyal relationships to collaborate on service projects that both benefit society and promote universal principles, all in order to contribute to greater understanding and peace. We passionately believe in the power of dialogue to change attitudes, which is why we are here today. With us today is Reverend Frederick Jerry Streets, a pastor at Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church in New Haven, Connecticut. He served as the Yale University chaplain from 1992 to 2007. He is also an adjunct associate professor of pastoral theology at both the Yale Divinity School and Columbia University School of Social Work. Reverend Streets holds the Master of Divinity degree from Yale University and both master's and doctoral degrees from Wurzweiler School of Social Work at the Yeshiva University. His interests are in pastoral theology, institutional leadership, and religion and social welfare. Without further ado, please welcome Reverend Streets.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for those kind words of introduction, and to all of you who have gathered for this conversation. I deeply appreciate your presence and the work that you're doing on behalf of peace around the world and for the work of the Peace Island Institute. I'd like to share with you a PowerPoint, and so we'll go to the shared screen. So the oft untold story of African Americans and nonviolence, the journey of an idea. If I were to ask you to think of one word, a one-word association, a word that to you resonates with energy and power, what word would that be? For some people, it would be love. Others, it would be peace. The word nonviolence. The list can go on. The extent to which that word resonates with you is something for us to think about in terms of how can words that are empowering, words that are peace-making, resonate in us in such a way that they become a part of us, that it affects even the nerve center of our being, as some writers have talked about it. In the Christian world, often there's discussion about how the word of God through Christ as a symbol of love, how that word becomes or became flesh. So how do we enflesh values, enflesh a word like love or peace or nonviolence. Um, and so this is the backdrop that I want to share with you, this brief story, and look forward to a conversation with you. As some of you know, the words attributed to Victor Hugo are familiar. Nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. Nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. It was unusual for there to be a Saturday afternoon worship service, but a huge crowd gathered inside of the sanctuary. They were predominantly African Americans. People quickly settled into their seats at the sign of a person entering the stage-like area just behind the church's pulpit. A few minutes later, a group of men, all clergy, dressed in dark suits, filled the seats positioned around the pulpit. A brief welcome and introduction of the speaker was given, and without fanfare, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped into the pulpit and began to speak. It was the summer of 1966, during which time Dr. King moved into a slum building on the south side of Chicago and led marches to protest against racism and housing conditions in some of Chicago's poorest communities. King himself would later remark how brutal and hateful the people were when he and others marched through the Marquette Park section of the city. Dr. King had come to the Antioch Missionary Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago at the invitation of its pastor, the Reverend Dr. W.N. Daniel, who was one of the most powerful and influential ministers in the city. A friend of Dr. King's, Reverend Daniel had been involved in the civil rights movement in Tennessee and was the first African American to graduate from Austin Peay State College. In 1964, after coming to Chicago in 1957, Reverend Daniels ran for Congress as a Republican, a race he would lose. It was common for Black Americans of his generation to be members of the Republican Party. As Dr. King spoke that day of his dream of freedom and our need as people of color to be proud of ourselves, people responded enthusiastically with "Amen" in agreement with what he was saying. Reverend Daniel often addressed issues of violence, nonviolence, and racial pride in his Sunday sermons. Now, I, as a teenager, sat in the front pew, looking and listening to Dr. King, observing the reactions of those on the platform, particularly those of Reverend Daniel and the crowd. I was 16, seeing and listening to Dr. King, whom up to that time I had only seen on television and pictures of him in the printed press. Elderly people who could barely walk with the aid of canes and walkers pushed themselves up from their seats and raised their arthritic arms and waved their hands in praise of what Dr. King was saying. He spoke about his philosophy of nonviolence and its importance for the survival, not just of Black people, but for all people. I had read different articles about nonviolence. Excerpts of King's speeches and writings were unavoidable in our community. Now, on that summer day in 1966, an embodiment of nonviolence, a word had become flesh, stood before me in the person of Dr. King. In August of 1979, I made my way to an auditorium at a California hotel to hear a presentation given by a Christian mystic and theologian, Dr. Howard Thurman. He was one of the guest speakers at the annual meeting of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, of which Dr. King had inspired the creation. One of the PNBC founders was him. He, along with a group of Black ministers, separated in 1961 from the very conservative National Baptist Convention led by Dr. Joseph H. Jackson to form the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Jackson was a very powerful minister of a large church in Chicago. He too was a charismatic speaker whose preaching style was more like a spellbinding lecturer than orator, as was Dr. King. Howard Thurman, as I said, was a Christian mystic and theologian who was a mesmerizing public speaker, as was King and Jackson, although he hardly spoke above a whisper and seemed to speak as though he was listening and repeating what someone else was whispering to him in his ear. I had always wanted to meet Thurman and did so. He offered me an opportunity to work with him, but I was too starstruck and intimidated to follow through with his gracious invitation. He died 2 years later in 1981. I later worked with others in helping to promote Thurman's legacy. His papers and lectures are digitized and are now available online. And there's a Howard Thurman Trust at Boston University. But these comments serve as the backdrop to a deeper question. Sitting there listening to Dr. King and speaking about nonviolence, I asked myself, where did this come from? Where did the idea of being an ambassador for nonviolence take up resonance in King's soul, if you will? How does any particular value, belief, become so ingrained in us that it affects the way we think, feel, and then, of course, act? So you heard me talk about my encounter with Dr. King. But did you know that many African Americans were involved in going and keeping abreast of the developments of India's struggle for independence and separation from British rule? A woman by the name of Juliet Darracott, a national secretary of the YWCA, was one of 2 African Americans in an American student Christian movement delegation to visit India. In 1929, she left the YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association, to become Dean of Women at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Howard Thurman, whom I just mentioned to you, here's a book called Visions of a Better World. It chronicles Dr. Thurman, his wife, and 2 colleagues' visit to India. He led a fellowship delegation, Thurman and his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, Edward Carroll, and Edward Carroll's wife, Finola. Edward Carroll would become one of the first bishops of the United Methodist Church in America. We all know something about Gandhi, the campaign he led, the time in which he lived. But African Americans became increasingly aware of Gandhi in the years during and after World War I, and after Gandhi's return to India from South Africa in 1915. The search by African Americans was on for a Black Gandhi in the United States because they strongly identified with Gandhi's method of nonviolent protest. Mind you, this is all happening in the 1920s. Dr. King was born in 1929. In 1921, the Chicago Defender, one of the Black publications, called Gandhi the greatest man in the world today. And W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, although they were rivals, both of them loved Gandhi. Du Bois convinced Gandhi to write a special appeal to Black people in the National Association of Advancement of Colored People's magazine called The Crisis, entitled To the American Negro. As some of you know, Gandhi was tremendously influenced by the writings of Leo Tolstoy and Henry David Thoreau. So was King. On leaving, after being in India and doing lecturing and meeting with Gandhi and his ashram, Howard Thurman was about to leave, and as he was leaving, Gandhi turned to Thurman and said, it may be through the Negro that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world. And sure enough, these men and women brought back this message, brought back the teachings led by Thurman and others, and culminated in the teachings and writings of Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who was president of Morehouse College, where Dr. King went to school. Baynard Rustin, as some of you know, was the architect and genius behind the March on Washington. He was a part of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. James Lawson, also a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, did a lot of the nonviolent training workshops for the civil rights protesters in the 50s and 60s. Dr. Lawson is still with us. He's in his, I think, late 80s, early 90s. I had a chance of visiting with him summer before last. He's still doing lectures and talks about nonviolence. Of course, I mentioned to you Howard Thurman on the bottom left, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and on the bottom right is Martin Luther King Sr., Dr. King's father. An interesting story some of you may know or may not know, that Dr. King was his birth name was not Martin Luther King. His birth name was Michael. But Dr. King Sr. had taken a trip celebrating the Protestant Reformation in Germany and was so impressed by the history and the work of Martin Luther that he came back when Martin King, his son, was around 2 or 3 years old, and legally changed his name to Martin Luther King Sr. and changed his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr. So African Americans have historically had a global or world view about India, Africa, and the Caribbean. African Americans drew inspiration from their struggle in the USA, from the freedom movements of other people of color from around the world, like in particular India. And African Americans demonstrated nonviolent civil disobedience in the US long before the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The genius of Dr. King and the beloved community he helped to further create lies in how he and other members of the movement made the words of nonviolence and civil disobedience flesh and blood for the greater good of America and the world. Through Howard Thurman, Mordecai Johnson, and others who had gone to India and came back and started teaching the philosophy of nonviolence, doing workshops, giving lectures. Martin heard these conversations and lectures as he grew up and was a student in Morehouse. And it's just amazing how this idea of nonviolence, how it took hold of and resonance in the person of Dr. King. So nonviolence is, and others as well, of course, nonviolence is an ideology, a worldview, a set of values and ethics, and a tactic that was taught to small groups of Black people and later groups of Black and white people throughout the South, at least from as early, if not before, the 1930s and onward. So African American nonviolent movements and civil disobedience demonstrated the power of having a clarity of purpose, having a sense of community, particularly in situations of life and death. It also demonstrates the power of community and the role of music and a proper ideology to restore strength and cope effectively with the trauma of the violence members of the community endured and the deaths they had to mourn. They transformed trauma into the triumph of soul force. I asked Dr. Lawson, how did people that he trained and how did he himself endure the violence, and to the extent that they did, he said it was their sense of community, their commitment and clarity to a purpose, their deep belief in nonviolence and how it can actually, as Howard Thurman used to teach, if you yield the nerve center of your being, when you totally surrender to an idea, it takes up resonance like DNA in your body, and it conditions how you think, act, and respond. And he also said that music was so important, that they sang before, they sang after movements, after brutal encounters, that kind of thing. And he was quick to say that there were a lot of people who didn't survive well, some whom are now still with us in later age, late 70s, 80s, and even early 90s, who suffer in silence the trauma of their nonviolent activities in the 50s, 60s, what we call the modern day civil rights movement. So when you think about how as an idea, nonviolence became a real human way of life and a way of being. Baynard Rustin used to say to Dr. King that he had to embrace nonviolence in such a way that he was totally committed to it, to be an exemplar of this principle. It had to be his way of being in the world and a way of living. It enabled and empowered its ambassadors to face with dignity evil, suffering, and death. And as I said in the beginning, Victor Hugo's comment, nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So African American nonviolent movements teaches us today that the importance of nonviolence, the importance of principle, the importance of community. But we also have to, admit that one can embrace an ideology, a set of values, a worldview that creates them to be a monster in the world. So powerful can this idea of surrendering to an idea be. But when we think about what's happening in our world today, the racial strife, the political unrest, the impact of the pandemic, the way by which we've seen people use violence, most recently, to say the least, about Charlottesville and the killing of George Floyd and others. This teaching of nonviolence and helping people to understand its power to transform and to promote life rather than destroy life is a lesson that needs to be even more promoted and taken up. So what I heard in 1966 and subsequently in the speeches of Dr. King received from Howard Thurman and his father and those group of Black men and women who went to India starting in the 1920s and came back and continued to teach and promote nonviolence in the Black community. King happened to emerge as, if you will, as America's Gandhi, and in some ways really the world's Gandhi. So it is somewhat of a haunting thing to think about Gandhi's statement to Thurman when he left India. It may be through the Negro that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world. Thank you for listening.
On behalf of everyone, thank you, Reverend Straits, for the amazing lecture and for giving us your time. In such a time where the fight for civil rights still continues, it is ever so important to broaden our knowledge about such topics. So thank you. We already have a few questions sent by our viewers, so we can start the Q&A session if that works with you.
Fine.
So the first question we have is, MLK says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So how can we stand against injustice around the world as a person or as a community?
Well, there's no one way, but one certain way is that it has to be identified, labeled, and called out. It cannot be ignored. So in whatever ways that and instruments that one has to be able to do that, through conversations, through lectures, through speeches, through writings, through teaching, whatever the means of communication that are at your disposal, it has to be called out, identified, and described for the reality that it is. The reason why there's a universal notion in your question, because violence is a threat to life everywhere. You can't um, the containment of violence is important, of course, but when it's present, it's a reminder that it can be present in any community at any point, and it has to be addressed on an ongoing basis. Every generation has to deal with it. It's not going to go away. It seems to be a part of the human condition, but violence could be inevitable, but it need not be preferable. And that's what we have to really stress, as well as its destructive nature. And there are all kinds of forms of violence, of actual physical violence, hurting the body, spiritual violence, hurting one's spirit, psychic, the way people demean one another, misogyny, different ethnic phobias. I mean, so the list goes on. So you just have to call it out. You can't be silent about it. That's the bottom line of what I'm saying to you.
Thank you. We'll move on to our second question sent in by an audience member. So they asked, can we say that MLK is the Gandhi of the USA?
Well, one could say that, but I mean, obviously there are two different time periods and two different contextual situations where both of these persons led nonviolent protests. In Gandhi's situation, to deal with the whole relationship between India and Britain, and we know the troubled history. Part of that history is a troubled history in the creation of separation of India, Muslims from Hindus. But I think it's kind of romantic to talk about King as America's Gandhi, but I think both of them would be more concerned about how each of us reflect the nonviolent way of life that they both came to know, so that it becomes more of a universal way of living rather than an assumption that it's an exceptional way of living. One of King's assistants, who was a young adult at the time, now still with us, one of the elders in our community, told me about a meeting they were sitting in, and they were debating about nonviolence. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he said Dr. King was a very good listener, and he listened for a long time, the pros and cons. And then he said, Dr. King said that if he was the last person on earth to embody the principle of nonviolence, he would be, because as long as there's one person who's able to do it, it takes away the excuse that it's not humanly possible. Think about that. If there's one person who can demonstrate it, it takes away the excuse that it's not possible as a human being to be an ambassador of nonviolence in the way that he was.
Thank you for that well thought out answer. Kind of going off of that, this next question has to do with that a little bit. Someone asked, it seems that no matter how much progress is made, there are always fallbacks. How do we continue to stay motivated even when facing hardships in the civil rights movement?
Well, it's my view of human development and human history, and it's certainly an important theme in all of the major world religious traditions. For an example, and the Christian scriptures talk about the fall of humankind. There are different ways of understanding human limitations, sin, evil, etc. We're still evolving as human beings, and we're not as bad as we used to be. We're not as good as we can become. But I wouldn't get this. I mean, it can be discouraging and disparaging to think about the repetition of things, but this is just part of life and part of being human. And we have to continue to put the expectation, to put the guardrails up, and keep pushing humanity to move toward its better angels. not to assume that where we are is as far as we can go. Because King is an example that we're not as far as we can go. We can go further. And some of the unfortunate incidences that have happened in the last couple of years, as bad as they were, as bad, as devastating and murderous as some of the expressions of violence were, you still have people to then respond and say, no, this is not who we want to be as a country, or this is not who we are as human beings, and articulate a different narrative. Um, part of the subterfuge of our weak side is the way it seduces us to give it more power than it has, to make us assume that our lesser angels will always win out. That's part of the deception. Some people may call it sin. Some people may say that's the work of the devil, or whatever how you might describe it. But no matter how dark it is, you can't allow yourself to eliminate any reason why you shouldn't light a candle.
Thank you. That is definitely true in today's world. We should always be the light in the darkness. We have another question from someone who is watching, and they have asked, what is the main message of MLK's I Have a Dream?
The main message? Well, in some ways, it's like asking someone what is the message of a poem or a piece of artwork. You know, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. A poem we can all interpret in subjective ways. But I think part of the genius of Dr. King's I Have a Dream is that he articulated what is basic to our nature. It's a universal dream, the universal dream of aspiration, and as we say in America, pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness unfeathered by other forms of human oppression. So I think he tapped into a universal aspect of humanity. It's not Dr. King's dream. It's not an American dream. It's a human dream, and in some ways, one could argue, at least from my perspective in the Christian community, it's the dream God had when God created us and looked at us and said, "That's good." Didn't say it was perfect. Said it's good. And if we're good enough for God, we can learn how to be good enough for each other.
Well, we don't have any more questions that I can see. So unless anyone else has any more questions, we can end the Q&A session. Once again, I would like to thank you, Reverend Streets, on behalf of Peace Islands Institute, for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure having you with us, and we're so grateful for you taking the time to come engage and dialogue with us and converse with us. Thank you as well.
I appreciate it too, but please, I really want people to seriously meditate, reflect, think about how an idea like justice and love, how it can really become a way of being for a person in the world and be the guide for our sense of living, for our personal mission in the world. And as I said, even though I was listening to King in '66, the ideas that he was articulating and grew into the King that we all know, was nurtured by all those people who was involved in the 1920s and 30s, some of whom before he was born. So you just think about the power of an idea, how it can be transformative if we're willing to surrender ourselves to it, not out of resignation, but out of joy, and move into a new way of articulating the divine that I think is in all of us.
Actually, those are very great words. Thank you. We actually have another question, so we're going to return back to one more question. I'm sorry about that.
The more the better.
Someone has asked, has Dr. King ever been tired of the slowness and gradual progress achieved by nonviolence practices?
Yes, I mean, some of his speeches, he even talks about that freedom doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability. You've got to work for it. And When he talked about how long will it be before justice, he would say not long. But he had, I think, a perspective about human nature and history that you have to be a partner with history in the sense that we're talking about it. To surrender to an idea means that you also have to be, in a spiritual sense at least, patient, not acquiescent, but recognize that there are forces at work that you're a part of that you cannot always put your hands on, but you have to live them out in a way with the kind of faith and hope that gives them the space to evidence themselves. So on the one hand, King pushed. Um, he was not a person to suggest that we should just wait till everybody's heart has changed. I mean, he even talked about himself that he'd rather have a law that puts a person in jail for hanging him rather than waiting for the person who wants to hang him to change their heart. I mean, we need laws, and he was one to, as you know, with others, to engage in a lot of pressure tactics to make things change. So it's learning how to pace yourself to be a part of the transformation and evolutionary process that I just talked about. So it's not about being impatient, but it's also not about being so patient that you look like you're standing still.
Thank you again, Reverend Streets. I believe we have another question. So we're not going to end the Q&A session yet. Someone has asked, was Dr. King uniformly embraced as a leading figure by all Black Americans, or did he face pushback in his own neighborhood and community as well?
Yeah, well, you know, with their sacred text that says a prophet is not without honor in his hometown. Yeah, there were a number of people within the Black community at the time who did not fully embrace what King was articulating, what he had to offer. That person I mentioned in my opening remarks, J.S. Jackson, who was, I told you, a very powerful religious figure in the Black community. He was the president of what was called the National Baptist Convention. And he was a brilliant man, PhD from, I believe, University of Chicago. But very conservative. And he argued and took up opposition to King often. Excuse me. This to show you the depth of his unfortunate pettiness. The street that his church was on was named one thing, and then after King was assassinated, they changed the name of the street to Martin Luther King Boulevard. He legally changed the church's address to the side street. So instead of it being 600 X Street, it was 55 West Street. That was how petty he was, that he didn't even, that's how much he hated King, that he didn't want his church address to even have King's name. And a lot of people who opposed him, you know, later on came around. Some really regretted it, the opposition. But no one will ever be totally accepted by everybody. And leadership is not a popularity contest. It's a conviction. It's a living a life of conviction.
Thank you once again, Reverend Streets. I don't believe we have any more questions. So unless we get any last minute ones again, I would like to once again thank you on behalf of Peace Islands Institute. I definitely agree with one of the points you made earlier that conversing and critical thinking is vital, especially in our society today. And we must take our work further and continue to stay active. So I thank you for conversing with us, for teaching us many new things today. And thank you as well to the many organizations who made this night possible. With that being said, if you don't have any last words, I hope everyone has the great rest of their night.
Thank you.
Thank you.